peoples come to work, so my peoples come first. I got worldwide family all over the earth, and I worry about them all for whatever it's worth.
My background is in software product development, and in 2015, I got very interested in figuring out what are the different ways in which we could actually solve climate change. Not just make it less bad, but make the whole thing go away. And that led me down the path of learning about the different methods of carbon removal from the atmosphere. And over a couple years of research, I found that we really already have all of the methods and tools and processes that we need in order to draw down the over 1 trillion tons of CO2 that we really need to if we're going to restore the atmospheric carbon balance. And that led to the founding of NORI in 2017, so about 3 years ago, really built on a concept of trying to make it easier for people to get paid for removing CO2 from the air. And what NORI is a two-sided marketplace where we work with suppliers. These are people who are performing some action that draws down CO2 and sequesters it for a period of time at least, and then certifies that after a verification process. And then those suppliers can sell the carbon to buyers, typically individuals or businesses and corporations that want to offset their emissions. Now, we're focused exclusively on carbon removal from the atmosphere. And when you hear the term carbon offset, 98% of the time, that is referring to some sort of carbon avoidance project, meaning the project does something that reduces the amount of carbon dioxide that is going into the atmosphere. It's not necessarily pulling carbon dioxide out that's already there. And we are focused on regenerative agriculture initially for 3 reasons: because it is incredibly scalable, incredibly affordable, and the entire food and ag industry is already moving in that direction. So we're working with farmers who are adopting practices like cover cropping and reducing tillage that ends up storing more carbon in the ground. But we want to operate sort of like an open source platform where we want people to propose new methods of carbon removal to us. So in the future, we'll support methodologies like, of course, tree planting, kelp, grazing, direct air capture, storing CO2 in construction materials, and so on. And so that's how we'll expand and scale. We launched in pilot phase about a year ago, and we're working on scaling up our market inside the US now.
Awesome.
Hi, can you guys hear me now? This is Bill.
Hi, Bill. Yes, we can. So I'd like to introduce Bill Kenkarp, co-founder and head of origination at All Infra, which literally stands for All Infrastructure for All, a company that's revolutionizing infrastructure finance as we know it. So Bill, I'm going to hand it off to you for an introduction and an overview of your background.
Yeah, and sorry for the complication. I switched to a ear device that seems to work. Bill Kenkarp, I'm connecting in from Hong Kong, and originally from the US, but have been out in Asia since 2001. And I've been focused on the environmental market for really all my time out in this region. So for about 6 years with a multinational, helping the company invest into climate-friendly renewable fuels. And then we set up one of Asia's first carbon asset managers back in 2004, heavily invested in climate-friendly assets under Kyoto Protocol. And then for Macquarie Bank ran a similar business for about 8 years, putting growth capital into renewables and into the climate market. All Infra we set up a few years back, really looking at different technology solutions to create efficiencies in both the financing of clean energy and climate-friendly assets, but also in optimizing the way in which the data and then the productization of that data is managed. And we looked at quite a number of solutions, but landed on a few, I would say, potent applications of blockchain. But what I would also say is that we were very careful to make sure what we're doing is rationalized against the realities of the assets and the markets that sit around those assets. So again, apologies for patchy connection earlier.
No problem. We have Stephen Haft, who might not need an introduction of himself, but who wears many hats and is currently head of global partnerships at head of global partnerships at Blockchain with Consensus. Steve, do you want to give us a few words on your background, which is definitely very interesting, given what you do at BSIC, as well as your time, literally your time at Time and AOL.
Thank you very much. I can't tell, is my video up, or am I just that sort of very handsome Consensus picture?
I think it's the latter.
That's too bad. Yeah, I don't seem to have control of my video on this panel invite. Somebody else has to turn on my video, which I'd be very happy to. I even put on a nice clean shirt this morning. So, so good morning. My name is Stephen Haft. I have the privilege of working at Consensus Software. At Consensus Software, I work on partnerships as well as in the media space. And for the last year and a half, I've had the opportunity to work on what we're now calling Consensus Climate. It's a sort of loose affiliation of some of the climate activists within Consensus, including, for example, within the Consensus family, let's say, including Bill, who spoke. I know Vanessa would like me to turn on my video. I don't have control of it on this invite. I would do it in a second, happily, if I could. My background includes actually several decades as a green lobbyist, working on mainly the domestic climate agenda here in the U.S., and other public policy positions. I worked, as Minnie mentioned, at Time Inc. just prior to joining Consensus as one of the leaders of the innovation efforts to move Time Incorporated, the largest publisher in the United States, publisher of Time and People and so on, over on to digital platforms. I have also a bit of history with BSIC, having worked with Vanessa and Red and others in sort of putting a structure around BASIC over the last couple of years. So thank you.
Great. I'm not going to introduce Sal because Sal already kicked off the prior discussion, but I'm going to jump right into our set of questions for this panel. So you've all been engaged in green work for quite some time. 2020 is sort of the year that the Kyoto Protocol gives way to the Paris Agreement. It's been a long journey with some bumps along the way, with I think the general consensus being that even though we've made significant strides with more ambitious NDCs to more aggressive targets and deadlines for net zero or carbon negative goals set by global corporations, we'd like to understand a little bit more about what differences each of you see Paris bringing to the climate space. And I'd like to start off with you, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, Minnie. I think the differences are quite considerable, especially here at a meeting of BSIC, because I do think there are sort of movements of ideas in the globe. We've all studied the same. We all went to the same history classes over the years, and we saw that period in the late 18th century in which there were the ideas of Locke and Rousseau played out in revolutions in the United States and France and elsewhere around the world. I think in this period of the, let's say, mid-2000s, there were two things going on that I think reflected each other. One was the writing of the Paris Accords, which were ultimately adopted in 2015 and signed in early 2016. And all of us in the blockchain space will recognize those as very important years for us as well. And ideas of decentralization, the ideals of trusted data existed both in the evolution of our tech and our community, as well as being quite explicitly referenced in the Paris Accords in ways that distinguish Paris from Kyoto. I mean, in Articles 4 and 6 of the, passed by 183 and signed by 183 countries, In Articles 4 and Article 6, you have quite explicit references to looking for implementations that end double counting and fraud in ways that it existed under and made possible under Kyoto. In Article 7 and Articles 13, they talk about the importance of transparency. The people of the globe want to know, are you fixing, are these efforts that are being undertaken by governments and non-state actors actually addressing climate change effectively, and demanded transparency for all efforts to implement the Paris Accords. Article 10 talked explicitly about engaging new technologies and spreading those technologies around the world. And you can see in just in those three examples, the literally point for point relationship of the ideas that are reflected in the Paris Accords with the capabilities and the tenets, actually, of blockchain and the blockchain community. So I would say that Paris, the UN, the state actors haven't explicitly acknowledged it, although I would say of the, let's say, 180 countries, I think there are several dozen who have at least tacitly and in some cases attended meetings which suggest that they do acknowledge that blockchain is an ideal, blockchain, which the UN likes to refer to as DLT, is ideally suited to implement the Paris Accords. And the Paris Accords implementation, as those of you who follow it may know, is still being debated. The 2020 was supposed to be the year in which the Paris Accords kicked in. The UN has not found the consensus around getting a rule book out on how Paris will operate. And actually what's held it up has been some issues over accounting and ledgering. So we see both a clear role for blockchain in the implementation of Paris, and we as part of the blockchain community who try to work with, educate, and even literally to the degree permissible, lobby the United Nations around these issues, have been urging the UN to recognize this and formally integrate blockchain as the implementation standard for the Accords.
Yeah, one of the main themes that Paris introduces and is punctuated throughout really is the need for reliable, transparent, and comprehensive information, both on emissions, climate actions, and support, with Article 13 touching upon the enhanced transparency framework. Enabling transparency to facilitate that trust is also a key characteristic and rationale for blockchain-based systems. Are you seeing sort of an inclination among state and non-state actors to use blockchain to meet those goals? And that's more for Sal, Bill.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. Just, I feel inclined to ask, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we're definitely seeing uptake from state actors and non-state actors. We're seeing some even nations consider how to use blockchain in their national emissions trading systems that are government managed, but those are, as I've seen, still sort of development and looking at different ways to link different national markets together using blockchain. But in terms of what's implemented, if you look at both state utilities and energy groups together with private and non-state groups, you see a lot in the energy and utility space, commercial and industrial real estate, even nature-based, so forestry and land use applications. But ultimately, the ways in which people are using blockchain to sort of increase the efficacy of efforts under I guess I would sort of put it under climate initiatives generally, not just Paris, but ultimately, given over 190 countries now are have set targets under Paris nationally determined contributions. Just about everything that's happening in most countries around the world are in some way, shape, or form being recorded under these national systems where they can be. But in any case, case by case, whether it's renewable assets or buildings or industrial sites, people are using blockchain to record data, to use that data to then package into, for example, things like green bonds or to support climate rating. And, you know, and one of the applications that we're quite focused on is using that data to create higher quality emission reduction instruments that can be either used internally or packaged up and sold and retired with a permanent, long-term permanent record. But yeah, indeed, we're definitely seeing blockchain come into play. There's some other interesting ideas that are getting launched where once you can say climate instruments are on digital rails, so to speak, you can then look at integrating those instruments into things like e-commerce and electric vehicle networks, where you're really getting out into a sort of a distributed market for climate finance, which is quite exciting.
Right. And based on that, Bill, how is blockchain sort of enabling new mechanisms for capital formation or allocation and the digitization of green commodities?
I guess, so maybe back to the, first back to the environmental products. So if you like, looking at the, back in the Kyoto markets, you had a fairly cumbersome and lengthy process to audit assets that were eligible under Kyoto to produce emission reductions. And that was by necessity, and the technology didn't exist. You had auditors go to the site, reading meters and writing reports and submitting those to the UN. And that is actually still the way much of the compliance market works, but increasingly getting more direct access to meters and recording that data directly in an immutable fashion on blockchain it's starting to serve to, in a sense, fortify the existing process. So you still have people visiting sites, but then furthermore, supplanting or accelerating some of that process. And so what that means then in terms of, I guess, financing and capital formation is in a highly volatile market like the emissions market, if you've got essentially the option value of being able to mint certificates in a more real-time or more proximate way and more reliable way, you've got a more robust financial product for the assets themselves. So that's on the revenue stream side. On the financing side, and I think this I would describe as under development, but rapidly under development. You've got, I would say, all of the major green and ESG ratings groups looking at blockchain as a way to have more real-time, transparent, and sort of permanent record of the environmental effect of assets that get financed. And you now have your ratings applying to a corporate or a green bond, for example. And so if you've got stronger green bonds where LPs or investors in those bonds have greater confidence that the actual emission reductions are verified, that the reductions are happening, they're permanent, and the record is permanent, then that over time should lead to cheaper capital, maybe more long-dated capital. In other words, the climate financing available for climate-friendly assets will get more cost-effective for asset developers.
And Sal, why don't you take a piece of this as well, if I may suggest, Minnie? Because you work with non-state actors to a considerable degree in this space.
Yeah. So the first, when I was speaking before the panel, I talked about two core use cases kind of leading up to this third use case. And so as we think about kind of the makeup of a global carbon footprint and how that's actually regulated, both in terms of jurisdictional mandates, national designated commitments, and then some of the interoperability and bilateral and multi-party coordination requirements defined in Article 6.2 and 6.4, look at the third application of this technology and kind of this global distributed system that allows for transparent accounting across jurisdictions and the tradability of instruments and emission reduction activities that Bill was describing and that Paul was describing as well within those contexts. And historically, I think as you look at kind of the traditional model of CSR, corporate social responsibility reporting, and how carbon is actually calculated within those contexts, there are significant opportunities for us to advance how both there's trust in the underlying data that composes the footprint, but also, furthering, the auditability and proof model around the scope 1 offset via technologies like what Paul has built and is driving to market in the US. And then as it relates to kind of these digital green commodities that can be, essentially proven all the way to source sensors and measurement grade meters that are actually calculating the production in kilowatt hours of clean energy as it's being produced. And so this third use case and kind of what we've been pushing forward together with Stephen and alongside some of our other big four firms is that, there's an opportunity here to define two domains, one for accounting standards around how this rule book plays out, and then more importantly around accounting information system design. So how do we build the accounting system era for non-financial factors in ways that is auditable and verifiable by design versus building systems that require massive process-based and technology-driven audits on a look-back basis. And so where possible, we're looking at these types of schemas to influence both the accounting standards in terms of how the rule book plays out that you described, Stephen, but also the system design in terms of how should enterprises and nations as well think about the cumulative accounting structures and accounting systems for carbon and other climate-related assets.
Great. We actually have a question from the audience for Paul. Paul, what is the DLT Nori is using, and what is the current carbon emission for running the blockchain node and associated cost?
We're built on Ethereum, so as the transition to version 2.0 continues, that'll eventually become a negligible issue. We're not really worried about it.
Great. And can you talk about how sort of blockchain for climate is playing into transformation, both with regards to renewables and distributed generation, specifically within agriculture? I know Sal sort of touched upon what we're doing in the real estate sector, but could you talk a little bit more about what's going on with agriculture?
Well, I think there are a couple different things going on. One of which I'm sort of less familiar with, but there is definitely a lot of use of blockchain in the ag sector for tracking movement and provenance of the supply chain in general. But that's basically how much I know about it. For our part, we're using blockchain for a few very specific reasons. One of which is the double counting issue mentioned from Kyoto that Stephen was talking about. So like in practice, the way that this works is if someone does like a carbon offset project in, say, Brazil, and they sell those carbon credits that they generate to a buyer in France, both Brazil and France end up counting that as an emissions reduction towards their overall climate target goals. And that's, it's sort of insane that that we are at such an advanced stage of technology, and we're still not applying double entry bookkeeping to a very, very basic practice. So that's why blockchain is important for tracking the movement for Paris targets. We use it not only for that, but also to eliminate a sort of double counting issue that happens in carbon markets in general, which is when these markets were set up, the idea was that there was a desire for a tradable commodity asset that could be that could create a commodities market where there was price discovery and more liquidity coming in, and you could forecast future pricing and that sort of thing. But what that means is that when someone does a project, they're issued a carbon credit, and then they sell that carbon credit maybe to a broker, maybe it gets into some sort of trading hands, and it's trading hands over and over and over again. And that's the same ton of CO2 that's represented by the carbon credit. So we think that that's a problem, because that means that for every second, third, and fourth sale of that carbon credit, they're not actually paying for an incremental new ton of CO2 to be avoided or removed. They're just pushing a piece of paper around. So what we've done differently is decided that when a ton of CO2 sells through our market, it is immediately retired, which is this carbon market language, meaning it cannot be resold. And we've separated out the method of payment for the carbon or the tradable asset from the carbon certificate itself. So that's where like we have a NORI token, and one token is always worth 1 ton of CO2. So you use the token to pay for the carbon, and then the carbon gets immediately retired. And therefore the token should become that tradable commodity asset. So that's kind of the design difference that we're trying to apply here to solve this double counting problem and really accelerate the rate at which carbon is coming out of the air. And that's only possible by using blockchain and cryptocurrency.
Right. Sal, do you want to add anything on there in terms of the real estate space and what we're seeing with some of our clients there?
Yeah, I think within many, to your point, real estate, but also on a broader basis, the points that Paul was kind of describing around the double entry issue is something that enterprises are facing as they're thinking about this accounting across, you know, their entire footprint, whether that's their scope 1 and 2 emissions as computed through their real estate footprint, which has been a fairly well-primed market for us to target with some of this innovation and accounting system design, in that there's a lot of smart building work already going on and a lot of thinking about how to aggregate and realize the power of building and environmental data in that context. But you know, I think at the end of the day, as it relates to kind of the power of blockchain behind the actual capture and provable outcomes, I think if you think about that in a broader context and within Bill's realm as well, if we can facilitate transparency to source over the origination of the activity, right? Whether that's, you know, an activity described as the actual capture function, or if it's as it relates to an accounting methodology for scope 2 and kind of the rec market structure. The ability to trace to source with high confidence and proof that, you know, that asset has not been actually retired twice, as Paul was describing, is a significant step forward in terms of how transaction models and market structures work today.
Bill, Bill, jump in, Bill, because I know you're talking directly to the UN Climate Agency, who now see a greater urgency in introducing a verification layer in the carbon capital markets, both in terms of credits and green bonds.
Yeah, that's right. And maybe if I could just add one little branch to what Sal and Paul were saying is that in relation to distributed energy generation, where you've got very disparate small assets, in addition to ensuring or reducing the risk of double counting using blockchain, another aspect is just ensuring that, for example, renewable production is matched with consumption. So where people are buying and selling renewable power from even from the top of a building into a tenant in the building, or from, you know, across a virtual power purchase agreement, using blockchain to digitally tag the production and match that in real time with consumption, avoids or creates assurance that you're buying green energy in addition to reducing double counting. To what Stephen's saying, yeah, indeed, you know, one of the challenges that the UN is facing is that on the positive side, there are far more participants in the current, you know, in Paris relative to Kyoto, but likewise, there are a lot more flexible mechanisms in the way that, you know, bilateral and multilateral structures can, you know, settle carbon debts and trade carbon between them. And so for that reason, the UN is really looking for a number of solutions, or looking at a number of problem sets and looking at solutions out in the market to fortify the way climate records are kept, the way, you know, essentially a ton is a ton is a ton. How do we know where it came from, and make sure that, you know, we're all sort of looking at these instruments in a sort of unified record. So they're doing that in relation to the carbon certificates themselves, but also very interestingly, looking at a similar thesis when you scale that up to green bonds, where in essence a carbon debt that sort of comes hand in hand with issuing a green bond is set out separately as an instrument that can be then tracked against the assets that are underneath that green bond. So it's quite exciting stuff and very innovative on the part of the UN, but still a lot of work to do there.
Thanks, Phil. I think we got quite a bit of insight across multiple sectors on this panel. I know we're right at time at 10:15. I just want to thank all of our panelists. We did have a few questions towards the end around sort of, the type of blockchain implementations, permission versus non-permissioned, and popularity of adoption. If you have any questions at all, you have the contact information for all the panel members. Please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.